All right. Welcome on this Sunday. Guess who's back? Back again. 12 is back. Tell a friend. Well, anyways, I hope y'all enjoyed that earlier with the OJ case that I did earlier. I hope y'all enjoyed that. I'm gonna get on here and read a little bit, and discuss some of this book. And like I always tell you guys, the psychiatric part of life or explanation for things is not my forte. That's not my level of expertise. So I don't claim to really know a lot of it. And as far as this book is concerned, I am reaching the psychiatric portion of it. So a lot of it I'm not going to really understand, but I'm going to do the best I can with it. Because this book up to this point, I got to get through it because, I've told people about this book and they've enjoyed me reading it and, talking about some of the cases in it. So I understand that there's some mixed emotions about this book. There's some mixed understandings about this book, or, people might not like the authors or whatever it might be. We can still agree to disagree, right? So I hope that you guys enjoy it. And as you're coming in, welcome. Sunday. Sábado. I mean, Domingo. What the hell am I saying? Domingo. Sábado is Saturday. Hey, Progressively Independent. Thank you, Aquarius, for being here. Thank you, Frank, for being here. Let me go ahead and keep going with this. It says, it is important to note that psychotic states can occur within the context of traumatic experiences, with the use of a certain prescription medications or due to certain medical conditions. Examples of the latter include Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, brain tumors or cysts, dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, stroke, some forms of epilepsy, and HIV and other infections affecting the brain. Psychotic symptoms can also arise while abusing or withdrawing from alcohol or illicit substances such as amphetamines, hallucinogens, marijuana, cocaine, sedatives, hypnotics, and opioids. Furthermore, transient, short-lived micropsychotic ideas, perceptions, and behaviors can occur in people with certain personality structures, especially under increased duress. Thus, it is imperative that we at least briefly review the 10 personality disorders described in the DSM, divided into clusters A, B, and C. In each, there are inflexible patterns of behavior and internal experiences that cause functional difficulties and personal distress. These patterns are long-term, generally beginning in the late adolescence or early adulthood. We should emphasize that some of these traits can occur in individuals in a non-pervasive manner. That does not give rise to significant difficulties or internal upset, such as the criteria for DSM personality disorder would not fully be met. Individuals with cluster A personality disorders exhibit oddness, eccentricities, or thought and social awkwardness and withdrawal like we might see to a greater extent of schizophrenia, never in the discrete episodes but across their lifetimes. So this is the area that really kind of bugs me a little bit because, like I just said, when it comes to psychiatric disorders and talking about the clusters, it really kind of goes over my head because I've never really understood it. I'm not claiming to understand it. I'm trying to get through this portion of the book so I can get to the next gradations of evil. I guess this is saying that individuals with cluster A personality, they exhibit oddness, eccentricities of thought, meaning that their thought patterns, eccentric, meaning it's all over the place, possibly. Social awkwardness and withdrawals like we might see in schizophrenic patients, never in discrete episodes, but across their lifetime. So it seems like you might be normal for a little bit, but then all of a sudden you have this area of schizophrenic-like behaviors or thought patterns. It says 3 of these conditions have been described: paranoid personality disorder. This involves a pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others. So this is one of the, I've worked in a psychiatric hospital. I've worked with people that have had these, but to me, they didn't really, you can tell when they're in their episodes, you can tell the difference between normality and not normality. And I don't know if it's because I'm a little off, that it seemed normal to me, but pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others. Well, it seems like if this is true, we have a lot of individuals in society that have these type of personality disorders now, because there's a lot of individuals that don't trust others and they're suspicious of intent. Schizoid personality disorder. It's characterized by this general pattern of social detachment and restrictive emotionality, with a preference for mechanical or abstract activities involving minimal human contact. Those with schizoidal personality disorder demonstrate schizoid traits alongside perceptual and cognitive distortions or eccentric behaviors. While some of these individuals discussed in our vignettes possess cluster A traits, this does not imply that they were fully or even partially detached from reality at the time they committed their crimes or ever in their lifetimes. So it always says, I read in this book, and it said that a lot of times individuals that have mental health issues, they usually don't commit crimes. So I guess this area right here that he's talking about in this book is when somebody is in a schizophrenic mindset or whatever, and their thought patterns are not really clear. Let me see what Truth is saying right here. It says Andrea plucked his victim's eyes out and stabbed into the reflection. He was afraid it would get him caught. Okay. And she said something up here. So it says the reader will note are reflected at various points along the gradations of evil scale. Histrionic personality disorder, I've heard of that. involves a pattern of excessive emotionality and attention seeking, such that one might be perceived as theatrical, flighty, or flamboyant, with hyperbolic, shallow mood states. So that would tell me that these individuals are very me type stuff. Um, Attention seeking would be like just trying to make sure that everybody notices them. They do things out of the eccentric mentality to be seen. Their moods are shallow. So that would state that they're not very in touch with their emotions, I would say. And like I said, this isn't my scale of expertise. So if I'm getting this all wrong, forgive me. Buy the book, read the book, look up the words. Okay? Persons who meet criteria for this condition are often easily influenced by the suggestions and opinions of other people. So it seems like that they're easily influenced by suggestions or opinions of other people. Like they have to have other people's approval. Those diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder tend to feel that way, that they possess special talents, powers, or qualities, such that are entitled to special treatment. As we saw earlier with OJ, they were calling him narcissistic. So I guess to use him as an example is, he played football really well. So he therefore felt that he was entitled to his celebrity status to be able to be treated differently, even though he was suspected of a double murder. They might exploit or manipulate others or demonstrate fundamental disregard for their needs and feelings of those around them. These individuals often feel devastated in situations in which they are made to feel normal, human, or commonplace. That goes along with that, because whenever people stop chanting his name, whenever after he was proven innocent, people walked away from him, and he was devastated because he was used to people holding him up to a higher standard. So he went back down to the normal state where the rest of us live, and it cascades into intense anger or shame. As we have seen, narcissism in some cases can prove a motivation in acts of extreme violence. Borderline personality disorder is often characterized by viewing people and experiences in polarized, black and white terms, which also involves an unstable sense of one's own identity and life goals. So, abrupt vacillation between all or nothing perception results in impulsive, sometimes self-destructive decisions and intense emotionality, which is difficult to modulate. In some instances, these feelings are disassociated and paradoxically experienced as numbness or emptiness. I can understand that. I can understand that. These various difficulties with affective stability pervasively affect one's relationships and psychological functioning. It is noteworthy that dissociative states can sometimes be associated with homicide or other serious acts of aggression. So, have y'all ever heard of somebody been kind of having dissociative disorder and committing a crime and not really being present in their body while they're committing this crime, and then come back and then they realize what they did, and then they're like dumbfounded that they committed a murder or some kind of crime? Have y'all ever heard of something like that? Because dissociative disorder is an interesting one, because while I was going through therapy, that's what I was diagnosed with. And I heard in a video the other day that they seldom don't do dissociative disorder anymore. That it's really not a personality disorder as much as they used to this, because and I don't know why that is, but the video that I was watching was saying that many times individuals that kind of blink out and then come back in, that it's really not a disorder, that it's just a way of people's functioning through stressful times. I don't know how true that is, but if it's true or if it's not, y'all correct me if I'm wrong. Typically followed by shock and confusion on the part of the perpetrator after he or she had reconnected with reality and oneself. However, serious violence authentically committed in the context of total dissociation is truly a rare occurrence. An antisocial personality disorder, which we discuss alongside our description of psychopathy, there is the aforementioned general, sometimes reckless disregard for the rights and feelings of other people. Well, antisocial personality, we've talked about that on this channel a lot of times, and we've even seen very many people that have this perplex disorder, and you can really tell somebody who's really antisocial. It's manifested as hostility and aggression, deceit, and manipulation, followed by little to no genuine remorse. These individuals can be very calculated without the feeling of remorse whatsoever. Kind of like the example that comes to my head is BTK. While he was in the courtroom and he was describing his crimes, if you remember that look on his face, he had no regard whatsoever while he was describing these crimes he committed. He didn't look happy. He didn't look sad. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look like he had any kind of remorse whatsoever. And that's scary whenever you think that somebody can do that to another person without any remorse whatsoever. Notably, as per the DSM, such a person must display these signs outside of the context of bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. These conceptualizations obscures the fact that one can have a psychopathic personality structure in addition to psychotic mood disorder or disturbance or schizophrenia, such that one can be psychopathic at baseline and transiently or fully detached from reality at certain points in his or her lifetime. As we have previously noted, when such individuals commit homicide or other acts of violence, we must carefully delineate to the extent that it's possible whether the crime was driven by psychosis, apparent personality features, or some combination thereof. No, I wasn't in a prison suit, but I was in therapy for a lot of different things. The DSM also delineates 3 cluster C personality disorders, which are not typically associated with the brief, fleeting psychotic state, sometimes seen in cluster A and B disturbances. However, in some individuals diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder, characterized by a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and extreme concern about negative evaluation of others. Social withdrawal and hypervigilance may actually represent schizoid detachment or nascent paranoia, which have not been identified. Dependent personality disorder involves a strong need to be taken care of by others, such as that one is intensely afraid of losing supportive relationships. Of note to us here, this disorder is sometimes present in individuals ranked in Category 3 of the gradations of evil scale, who blindly follow powerful psychopathic types who commit heinous acts, sometimes even participating in them. So in number 3, we learned about individuals that were not as strong, that they were led into high-risk situations or followed individuals that committed heinous crimes and even may have participated in them without even wanting to participate in them. I would not say that this would have been like the person we saw the other night, Heidi. I wouldn't say Heidi was one of these type of people. I would say that if you were going to rank somebody that had this kind of supportive relationship, that was intensely afraid, it would be like someone that knew that their significant other were doing these things, but yet for fear of losing them or the stability that they offered, they went along with it. And I'm trying to think of an example of which this happened because I remember a mother was standing by her man, so to speak, as the individual was doing harm. Okay, let's talk about the Stephen Stern situation. That would be a perfect example of this, I believe. Jennifer stood by him while he was doing what he was doing for the fear of losing supportive relationship. So I could be wrong, but that's my thought on that. Um, it seemed like she blindly followed him and she looked at him as being more powerful than her. Finally, obsessive compulsive personality disorder involves a preoccupation with orderliness, rules, and regulations, often to the point of rigidity and loss of efficiency. These individuals tend to be viewed by others as controlling and stubborn. Notably, what we do not see here are the magical, psychotic-like ideas that can sometimes be seen in obsessive-compulsive disorders, a condition that should not be confused with this similarly named disturbance of personality. We should also touch upon the potential relationship between violence and psychotic illness, although an exhaustive review is beyond the scope of this volume. The academic literature indicates that the majority of people with mental illness are not dangerous, and the most violence is, in fact, committed by individuals without mental disorders. However, some evidence suggests that psychotic symptoms may be significantly related to the risk of violence. So there it is, where it said that we have never really heard of people that commit violence that are mentally ill. It's on the other end of the spectrum, so to speak. It had been reported that 5 to 10% of offenders incarcerated for homicide meet criteria for schizophrenia. 5 to 10%. A 2009 meta-analysis of 204 studies of psychosis as a risk factor for violent behavior yielded that persons with psychotic illness had a 49 to 68% increase in potential for violence relative to individuals not meeting criteria for psychiatric illness. Non-adherence to psychotropic medications and poor insight about one's psychotic symptoms have been shown to mediate the relationship between psychosis and violent behavior. A review of 22 studies found that major psychiatric disorders, particularly schizophrenia, are associated with higher risk for interpersonal aggression, accounting for 5 to 15% of community-based violence. So 5 to 15% of community-based violence is associated with particularly schizophrenics. This was even true in the absence of alcohol or substance use. Elsewhere, however, abuse of alcohol or illicit drugs has been implicated as a key mediating factor and may in fact account for more of the risk than psychotic illness itself. Psychologist Dr. Eric B. Elbingen and psychiatrist Dr. Sally C. Johnson identified a complex interplay between demographic factors, alcohol and substance abuse, adverse life events, and environmental stressors and violent behavior associated with severe mental illness, making violence prediction challenging. So, whenever you're looking to challenge these types of predictions, it's associated with severe mental illness. The MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study, which evaluated 1,136 recently discharged psychiatric patients over the course of a year, attempted to address methodological issues that had previously limited similar research and to disentangle interwoven factors. The prevalence of violent behaviors among these with major mental disorders who did not abuse substances was found to be indistinguishable from a general population comparison group drawn from the same neighborhoods. Violence risk was doubled by concurrent substance abuse. Notably, patients with schizophrenia showed the lowest occurrence of violence throughout the year, 14.8%. Relative to those with bipolar disorder, 22%, or major depressive disorder, 28.5%. However, violence associated with these conditions is likely to be the most frequent soon after hospital discharge, and community-based samples of individuals with these disorders are not likely to display similarly high rates of violence. Moreover, delusions were not found to be associated with violence in the MVRAS, in contrast to previous evidence linking violence and delusion that threaten to override one's capacity for self-control or make one feel unsafe. So this is pretty interesting, but it's, it's a lot. MVRAS data have recently been reanalyzed with contrasting results, depending upon whether one's objective is to identify statistical predictors of violence or to establish relationships that allow for considerations of casualty. Researchers Dr. Simon Ulrich, Robert Kears, and Jeremy Colwood found that a prospective model confirms initial findings. However, the actual timing of psychotic symptoms relative to violent behaviors is considered, a relationship emerges between violence and delusion, specifically involving thought insertion, possessing unique powers or gifts, and being spied upon, plotted against, followed, or under the control of a person or a force. Anger due to these delusional beliefs was found to be a mediating factor, except in the case of grandiose delusions. Elsewhere, command authority hallucinations, auditory hallucinations that instruct an individual to act in a specific way with violent content, delusional beliefs, especially a persecution, or both have been linked to higher violence potential. So, let me see what's going on in chat. Well, I'm glad you didn't want it in the first place. Now you're free to go be Dr. Vanna's mod. I'm sure you'll do a good job over there. I welcome you here with or without a wrench. It doesn't matter to me. You're still the same person, right? And I didn't block him just for that. There's other reasons. So it is my show, and I can choose to regulate it the way I wish. But like I said, I like you with or without a wrench. I like your expertise on some things, your intelligence on some things. So just don't be disruptive. Don't be disruptive. Everything's cool. And I'm sure John, if he really wanted to be in here, he'd email me and say, "Why did you block me? That wasn't cool." But obviously it doesn't matter to him that much. And other people that have been blocked, I believe that we should be able to talk about some things before it happens. So, you're still the same person with or without a wrench. And I'm happy that you're here. So if you want to be here, you can be here. If you don't want to be here, you don't have to be here. I respect you with or without a wrench. Just don't start drama. I'm already having a hard enough time trying to get through this. Thank you. With all of these concepts and findings in mind, we turn now to a highly unusual case that falls within the sparsely populated category of the gradations of evil scale, in which homicide, torture, psychotic illness, and a psychopathic personality structure are all observed. The gruesome story we will describe is all about more interesting, in that it involves a rare pre-1960s serial killer who displayed many of the characteristics we will link in part 2 of this book with the post-1960s era of new evil. Notably, however, serial murder with a psychotic element appears to have always been uncommon. Identified as a clear motivating factor as only 6% of serial killers between 1900 and 2018, as we have previously noted. The case of Albert Fish, the whiskered, seemingly innocuous gray man who sexually assaulted, mutilated, cooked, and ate children is truly the stuff of nightmares. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, the youngest of four children, to a 75-year-old fertilizer manufacturer who was said to suffer from religious mania, and his 32-year-old wife who experienced auditory hallucinations. There was an extensive history of mental illness in other members of the family. 7 relatives were diagnosed with psychoses or psychopathic personalities. 2 died in institutions, 1 was an alcoholic, and others were described as completely crazy. When Fish was 5, his father died of a heart attack, and his mother, who found herself struggling to make ends meet, placed him in an orphanage, where he would spend the next 4 years. His birth name, Hamilton, led the other children to playfully call him Ham and Eggs. So he rechristened himself Albert, after a brother who had also passed away. At the orphanage, he was routinely whipped and beaten, already at this young age becoming sexually aroused by the experience of physical pain. So, at this very young age, he was becoming aroused by physical pain. He also found a peculiar pleasure in being cruel to others, remarking later in life, "I always had a desire to inflict pain on others and to have others inflict pain on me. I always seemed to enjoy everything that hurt." He was a frequent bedwetter and attempted to run away on numerous occasions. So that's an interesting case right here. Around 1879, Fish returned to the care of his mother, who was now gainfully employed. At age 12, he initiated a sexual relationship with a telegraph boy, who introduced him to urophagia and coprophagia, clinical term for the consumption of urine and feces, respectively. The budding killer began passing long hours at public bathhouses, watching the other boys disrobe. In his early 20s, he relocated to New York City, where he worked as a prostitute and began sexually assaulting young males. He also earned money as a freelance decorator and house painter, which would later raise questions about the possible impact of lead-based paint upon his nervous system. At age 28, Fish entered into a marriage arranged by his mother, fathering 6 children, all the while molesting boys without the knowledge of his family. To their surprise, he was arrested for theft in 1903 and incarcerated at Sing Sing. Following his release, Fish embarked upon a relationship with a male lover who took him to a wax museum, where the two encountered a model of a bisected penis. The image left a powerful impression upon him, and he therefore found himself morbidly obsessed with the idea of castration. He later tied up 19-year-old intellectually disabled Thomas Kedden in a barn, and after torturing him for 2 weeks, severed his penis. "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me," Fish would later say. He left the victim a $10 bill and a goodbye kiss before abandoning him to bleed to death. He had considered mutilating the man's entire body and carting it home, but was sufficiently clear-headed to recognize how conspicuous he would be traveling with rapidly decomposing human remains. In 1917, Fish's wife left him for a male boarder, taking nearly all of their possessions with her and leaving him to raise their children on his own. At that time, he began driving them to a cottage in Westchester, New York, where he would climb to the top of a hill at night and bay at the moon with his hands raised. "I am Christ. I am Christ." He developed a taste for raw meat and served it to the family meals. At that time, he began hearing a voice he believed to be that of St. John the Apostle. Interestingly, the namesake of the orphanage where sexual pleasure and pain were first coupled in his mind in childhood. And I will send you an email. Don't worry, I will. I believe we're still friendly. I mean, with or without a wrench, it doesn't matter to me, okay? We're still friendly. Like I said, no hard feelings. And following the evangelist's instructions, wrapped himself up in a carpet. He experienced intense visions of Christ and his angels, and quoted God as revealing things to him, such as, "Happy is he that taketh thy little ones and dasheth their heads against the stones." He came to believe he should purge and atone for his sins with physical suffering and human sacrifices, and that God had commanded him to torture and castrate boys. Fish began subjecting himself to a series of bizarre masochistic acts, including inserting needles into his groin and abdomen and beneath his fingernails, stuffing lighter fluid-soaked bits of wool into his anus and lighting them on fire. I would not. I would. I would not recommend this at home. I would not recommend this at home. I don't know what video you're talking about, but I would definitely do that. No problem. In 1919, beating himself or having his children or other victims do so with a paddle studded with nails. In 1919, he stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Washington, D.C. It became his preference to assault African American or cognitively impaired children, whom he felt would not be missed. 5 years later, he began killing with a meat cleaver, a butcher's knife, and a handsaw, which he calls his implements of hell. I'm in the middle of a live, so I can't really explain that. I will explain it though. And do me a favor. Tell Dr. Vana not to come over here anymore. She's not welcome here. You're welcome here, but she's not. So if she comes over here, she will be blocked. So that's between my decision and my decision only. I don't have to let you know for any other reason other than I know you are close. So if you just relay the message, tell her she's not welcome over here anymore. Okay? See, you're messing me up. You're messing me up where I'm trying to read. So we're either going to have this conversation in an email or we're not going to have this conversation at all because I'm trying to read this to the subs. They want to hear it and you're messing me up. Okay? So you're welcome to stay. You're welcome to stay. You're welcome to be here. I have no ill against you. Okay? I have no ill against you. I'm not trying to make this about you. I'm just saying that there's reasons that I've done this. So, as far as she's concerned, she should know what she's done. And if she has no clue, then she doesn't deserve to be over here anyways. All right. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Please refrain from commenting on this anymore. I'm losing my place in reading this, and I don't think it's very fair to the chat. Thank you. So where was I? In 1919, he stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Washington, D.C. It became his preference to assault African American or cognitively impaired children, whom he felt would not be missed. 5 years later, he began killing with a meat cleaver, a butcher's knife, and a handsaw, which he called his implements of hell. In 1928, the nearly 60-year-old Fish, masquerading as a farmer named Frank Howard, responded to a classified ad placed by an 18-year-old New York City man. While his objective was to draw away the intended victim and torture him to death, Fish unexpectedly encountered the man's 10-year-old sister, Grace Budd, and his plans were instantly changed. Presenting to the family as pleasant and kind and charmingly describing his 20 acres of farmland and amiable crew, he readily acquired her parents' permission to accompany her to a birthday party, supposedly being held for his niece. She was never seen again, alive or dead. 7 years later, after another man had served jail time for the murder of Bud, Fish, who was then a senior citizen, sent an anonymous letter to the child's parents, which callously explained how he had killed, dismembered, and cannibalized her. It read in part, "We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I'd already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run. Down the stairs, I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I choked her to death and then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms. Cooked and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. It would later emerge that he had placed the girl's head in a paint can to drain her blood before packaging up other parts to transport to his home. And before anybody starts saying that I am vile for reading this or my channel is one way or the other, it really doesn't matter to me your thoughts on my channel. You don't like it? It's too vile for you? Don't come and listen. This is real stuff right here that I didn't write. This was written by a doctor and another individual about this murderer that actually did this thing to other people. You know what I mean? So try to remember that when you come to this channel. It's real. It's real. I don't sugarcoat things. 1930, Fish remarried, but he and his new wife separated after just 1 week. He was arrested for mailing an obscene letter to a woman who answered a false advertisement he posted for a maid position, and hospitalized at Bellevue for observation through 1931. And deriving pleasure from using obscene language in his message to a relative stranger, the killer was engaging in one of his several paraphilias known as scatologia or coprolalia, and we discussed what those were earlier. 3 years later, he was arrested for the murder of Grace Budd, threatening the arresting detective with a razor blade. Fish later confessed to the murder of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney, who disappeared from his Brooklyn home in 1927. The child had last been seen playing with a friend, who, when asked about Gaffney's whereabouts, eerily replied, "The boogeyman took him." A witness spied Fish on a trolley, dragging the boy, who was not wearing a coat, in the dead of winter and crying for his mother. The killer explained that he brought Gaffney to an abandoned house, where he stripped, bound, and gagged him before burning the clothes. The following day, he beat the boy with tools to tenderize him in the way one prepares meat to render it more palatable. He then whipped the victim to the point of bleeding with a homemade cat and nine tails, cut off his ears and nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, and gouged out his eyes. The frenzy culminated with Fish piercing the boy's belly with a knife and drinking his blood as he expired. The killer then bagged up portions of the body in potato sacks and tossed them into a pool of stagnant water. Other parts were brought home. The ears and nose and pieces of the face and belly were made into a stew, and the buttocks were roasted and prepared with gravy. He remarked in his confession, "I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet, fat little behind did." If this doesn't tell you how distorted a reality these individuals have, I don't know what will. I don't know what will, because this is a case that was way back when, and he obviously did some things to these children that is unfathomable. During the 1935 trial, Fish was found to be insane by criminal court. You believe so? Psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wortham, who diagnosed paranoid psychosis in light of Fish's descriptions of intense hallucinations of the voice of God commanding him to kill. Fish was found guilty and sentenced to death following imprisonment at Sing Sing. Onlookers struggled to believe that the decrepit, stooped-over Fish was responsible for so much unspeakable evil. Wortham himself would later marvel how meek, benevolent, and gentle the killer seemed. If you wanted someone to entrust your children to, he wrote, he would be the one you would choose. He also noted that when describing the slaughter of Billy Gaffney, he spoke in a matter-of-fact way, like a housewife describing her favorite methods of cooking. But at the times his voice and facial expression indicated a kind of satisfaction and ecstatic thrill. I said to myself, however you define the medical and legal borders of sanity, this certainly is beyond that border. I agree. Once again, BTK comes to mind whenever I'm reading about this individual, because if you've never seen him testify in front of a court, he is so stoic, no emotion whatsoever. He's able to sit there and recant his crimes without any kind of feeling or remorse. He describes it just like he's describing a shopping list. Just like describing a shopping list. Y'all let me know what you think of this so far. Yeah, I agree with you, Cash. He was evil. For sure. You should cover Austin Howralph. Okay. I'll do some research on that person and see what he's all about. Fish subsequently confessed to the killing of Frances X. McDonald, an 8-year-old girl on Staten Island whom he sexually assaulted, then strangled to death with his suspenders in 1924. He was suspected in 1932 murder of 15-year-old Mary O'Connor, whose mutilated body was found in a wooded area not far from a home Fish had been painting. He was confidently linked to at least 100 sexual assaults across the country, but Fish boasted 400 victims in every state. Way back then, he was boasting this. Way back when. Prior to Fish's death in the electric chair, he reportedly remarked that the electrocution would be the supreme thrill of his life. Daily News reporter Norma Abram wrote of the killer's forthcoming execution, his watery eyes gleamed at the thought of being burned by heat more intense than the flames with which he was seared his flesh to gratify his lust. A word about cannibalism and vampirism. Albert Fish's acts of cannibalism and vampirism, which refer respectively to the eating of flesh and internal organs, and the drinking of blood, may be the aspect of this case, and people find most horrifying and unfathomable, particularly because he exclusively feasted upon children. Intriguingly, however, his element of his crime did not figure heavily into his designation to Category 20 of the Gradations of Evil scale, which is instead warranted by his pattern of repeat homicide and protracted torture in conjunction with both psychopathy and psychotic illness. Indeed, cannibalism poses a unique challenge on several levels for the 22-year-old point continuum. First, there is some disagreement about whether or not cannibalism has always been deemed as evil, forbidden on moral grounds across all time and space. Anthropologists tell us that cannibalism was practiced in past centuries by indigenous peoples in numerous geographic areas, including Sumatra, New Guinea, and the Fiji Islands. and elsewhere in Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, areas of the West and Central Africa, the Amazon basin, and parts of the Solomon Islands. Moreover, it appeared that Neanderthals who inhabited the Maloa Gorsi cave in modern-day France approximately 100,000 years ago engaged in some degree of cannibalism. In ancient Egypt, and indeed at various points in recent centuries, it was employed as a desperate means of survival during periods of famine. As the reader may have noted, it is possible for such act to fall into a wide range of categories in the gradations of evil scale, depending upon one's context, motive, and psychiatric state, as well as the presence or absence of other elements, such as homicide, sexual assault, and torture. We have reviewed infamous crimes in which cannibalism was a result of severe mental illness, as was the case with fish, and drug abuse that with 31-year-old Rudy Eugene under the influence of marijuana and potentially some other illicit substance was found naked on the MacArthur Causeway in Miami, Florida, devouring the face of a 65-year-old homeless man in 2012. I'm sure most of you have heard about this case. In a horrendous case from 2009, police visited the home of 34-year-old Angelo Mendoza, who was intoxicated with PCP, and were told by his injured 4-year-old son, "My daddy ate my eyes." We have also examined cases in which cannibalism and vampirism were an aspect of cult or alternative spiritual activity, sometimes intended as a perversion of the Christian concept of Holy Communion or a means of uniting members into a cohesive family. For instance, blood consumption for the latter purpose was practiced by double murderer Roderick Farrell as part of a vampire cult, in which he assumed the identity of a 500-year-old vampire named Vasago. Finally, we have examined crimes in which sport or exhilaration were the chief motivation for cannibalistic acts, occasionally for paraphilic purposes. In 1981, Japan's Asai Sagawa, who had a long history of sexual fantasies involving cannibalizing beautiful women, invited classmate Renee Hartfeld to his apartment to work on a school assignment, shot her in the neck with a rifle, engaged in necrophilic acts, and devoured parts of her body over the course of 2 days. Arrested while carrying the uneaten remains in 2 large bags, he went on to gain cult status in his native country following his release from prison, appearing in softcore pornographic films with cannibalistic themes, and even working as a sushi critic. More disturbing is the 1985 case of John Brennan Crutchley, dubbed the Vampire Rapist. After abducting a teenage female hitchhiker, he immobilized her by tying her limbs to a countertop. While taking home videos, he repeatedly raped her and drank of the 40 to 45% of her blood he had extracted by the way of needles inserted into her arm and wrist. The particularly infamous gay serial killer, necrophile, and cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 males between 1978 and 1991. Having solicited prostitutes or lured unsuspecting men from bars, he typically drugged, raped, and strangled victims before dismembering them and engaging in sexual acts with their corpses or body parts. Wow. Just reading that, just like, wow. Dahmer eventually became preoccupied with the notion that he could transform his victims into zombies to serve as submissive sexual partners, entirely under his control. To that end, he drilled holes into drug victims' skulls and injected hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. When his crimes came to the attention of authorities in 1991, police raided his Milwaukee, Wisconsin apartment, which reeked of decaying flesh. To the horror, they found an altar containing candles and human skulls in the closet, 2 skulls resting on a computer, bodies being dissolved in acid in large drums, and countless disturbing photographs. If you watch that on, I think it was Netflix that did the Dahmer one. He was very prolific by taking photographs of his victims. They also discovered a severed head and other body parts in a refrigerator, preserved in liquids and jars, a human heart in a freezer, and a decomposing penis and a pair of hands. It emerged that Dahmer was eating some of his victims' body parts, including hearts, biceps, and livers, earning him the ghastly nickname the Milwaukee Cannibal. He would later claim that his primary objective was to keep his victims from ever leaving him by way of his various atrocious acts, a theme that also emerged in the story of another cannibal, Armin Muse, whom we have already discussed elsewhere. The only motive there ever was, Dahmer would say during a 1994 interview with NBC's Stone Phillips, was to completely control a person I found physically attractive, and keep them with me as long as possible, even if it meant just keeping part of them. So these individuals, they they get in their mind, well, I don't want to let go of you, so I got to kill you, you know, um, just to keep you with me, just to keep you with me. Cannibalism and vampirism are hardly new evils. We shall see, however, upon our transition to part two of this book, that in the post 1960s era, there have been a number of shocking cases involving forcing others to engage in cannibalism against their wills, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. We observe unconscious forced cannibalism in a 2010 case in which three homeless men in Russia fatally stabbed and beat a man with a hammer, dismembering and cannibalizing his body. They then sold the remnant to a meat kiosk where they were incorporated into kebabs and pies in a manner reminiscent of the fictional killer Sweeney Todd and his partner in crime, Miss Lovett. It is unclear, however, whether the eatery's owners were aware that they had purchased and prepared human flesh. In the end, authorities could locate no trace of the portion of the victim's body sold to the kiosk, since it had been entirely consumed by unwitting patrons. As an example of the conscious form of forced cannibalism, at the time of this writing, it is alleged that five Louisiana residents kept a 22-year-old autistic female relative in a cage, beating her and singeing her with cigarettes, and dousing her with human waste from a septic tank. The horrifying accusation continues that members of the group forced her to open an urn containing and cremated ashes of her late mother, poured them into a cereal bowl, and eat them with a spoon while her captors looked on and laughed. So that is category 20. Whoa. Before I start on category 21, can y'all let me know what y'all thought of category 20? I know there's a delay, so if y'all could kind of let me know what you thought of that. I've never heard of that one either, Texas. Welcome to the chat, by the way. You know, it's very disturbing, to say the least. You're not hungry anymore? Yeah, I don't blame you, Rondi. That's quite explicit, to say the least. Melissa, welcome. Texas, welcome. Cash already said welcome to you. I hope y'all are enjoying this. I'm trying to keep it flowing as fast as I can because I know it's kind of boring to hear somebody reading, but this is some interesting stuff that you don't hear about every day on true crime. And the last thing I want to do is have you guys feel like I'm dragging just reading on. Let's go with category 21. It says, like individuals in category 19, a psychopathic person ranked at level 21 of the scale is not known to have killed or suspected in at least one homicide that has not been confirmed. When there is a claim or accusation of a murder, it is generally not described as an integral part of the offender's sadistic objectives, but rather as having occurred in the service of some practical end, such as eliminating a witness. These rankings are distinguished, however, by the fact that persons assigned to Category 21 physically torture human victims. The torture is intentionally prolonged, particularly cruel, and likely to be both psychological and physical in scope. Note that Category 21 torturers differ from these categorized at levels 18, 20, and 22 of the scale, in that the latter three rankings require a history of homicide. Moreover, while the torture seen in Category 20 and 22 is deliberately drawn out, as it is in Category 21, the torturous acts associated with Category 18 are not protracted in nature. The constellation of traits and behaviors that categorizes Category 21 can be illustrated with the case of Cameron Hooker, born in California in 1953. Virtually nothing is known of Hooker's background except that after graduating high school in 1972, he hooked up work in a lumber mill. 3 years later, at age 22, he married a 15-year-old girl named Janice, an alleged victim of abuse by her family. Her husband called her a whore and subjected her to sexually sadistic acts, such as repeatedly hanging her nude by her wrist and whipping her or nearly drowning her. Likely terrified of him, she did not resist. After Hooker informed his wife that he intended to abduct a young woman and force her into sexual slavery, Janice reportedly secured a promise that he would whip the slave in lieu of herself so that she might more easily become pregnant. She also asked him to forego vaginal sex with the slave. According to Hooker's wife, and it is critical to note for the reason just reiterated, that his allegation had never been proven. In January of 1976, the couple abducted an 18-year-old hitchhiker, Marlise Banhickey, in California. She was reportedly stripped and suspended from the ceiling by her wrist and tortured for 1 day before her vocal cords were severed with a knife, possibly to quiet her screams. So this goes with the kind of like the case that we saw the other night on the individual that had those pulleys in his basement and a dog kennel. I can't remember his name, but he was the one that had slaves as well. Wow. Janice claimed that her husband fatally shot the woman in the stomach with a pellet gun and buried her in a shallow grave near a state park. Wow. What is known for certain is that on May 19th, 1977, the couple abducted 20-year-old Colleen Stan as she was hitchhiking from her home in Oregon to visit a friend in the Golden State. Miss Hooker held a newborn son in the passenger seat. After driving to an isolated area, Mr. Hooker held a knife to Stan's throat, bound and gagged her, and covered her head with a homemade wooden box. A terrifying contraption, apparently designed to totally disorientate her, before transporting her to their home in Northern California, city of Red Bluff. Stripped and removed from the device, Stan was blindfolded, hung from the wrist, and whipped before the hookers had intercourse beneath the dangling victim. Stan was then stuffed into a coffin-like box, which have deprived her of virtually any sensory experiences. Chains surrounded her neck and ran the length of her body. A small blur placed inside the box provided air. Anyone who has ever been in a small, tight space, such as a closed MRI scanner, knows how difficult this is to endure for even a single hour. Dan was kept in this box nearly all day for the next 3 years. and not permitted to make a sound. When in need of the toilet, she had to use her feet to slide a bedpan underneath herself. There was virtually no air to breathe, and the temperature inside the box sometimes exceeded 100 degrees. She would later say of the nightmarish ordeal, "He would keep me in there for like 22, 23 hours a day. It was absolutely pitch black in this box. Totally dark. I had claustrophobia so terribly bad. I would get really anxious and focus on being locked up in the box and listening to that fan next to my head, just going on and on and on, just feeling like I was going to lose my mind." Fed only cold scraps, Stan lost 22 pounds over the first 4 weeks. It was 3 months before she was bathed by her captors. Permission was required to speak. She was taken out of the box like a toy for daily rounds of whipping and electrical shocks. She was also stretched on a homemade torture rack, which permanently damaged her back and one shoulder. Hooker began raping the victim using only implements for penetration, lest he breach his vow to his wife. By November 1977, Stan was being forced to do chores around the house, always in the nude. In early 1978, Mr. Hooker informed her falsely that he was a member of the company, supposedly a secret organization that enslaved women for pleasure and profit, and which would retaliate against her and her family should she attempt to escape. She was made to sign a slave contract. Whoa, another one. Granting full control over her body, soul, and personal possession to Michael Powers, which was Hooker's pseudonym. Here's another one that was just like that guy the other night, where he made his first wife sign a slave contract. I don't know if y'all remember that one. Her captors also signed. Stan was then placed in a collar and renamed Kay, robbing her of the last vestige of her former life and sense of self, which later became Kay Powers. A new box was constructed and unimaginably incorporated into the frame of the Hooker's waterbed. Rack, torture, and rape were now simultaneously. Stan, referred to as a piece of furniture to test her loyalty, she was instructed to put an unloaded gun into her own mouth and pull the trigger. In 1980, Stan was forced to beg for money and made no attempt to flee due to terror of the company. She was eventually permitted to sleep outside of the box, chained to the toilet on the floor of the Hooker's bathroom. So here's a trauma bond with these people. She was allowed to phone her family claiming that she was employed as a nanny for a nice couple. In March of 1981, Mr. Hooker drove Stan to see her parents and grandmother, where he was introduced as her boyfriend, Mike. She spent the night with them and was picked up by her captor the following day. Apparently regretting having given Stan so much freedom, Mr. Hooker returned to keeping her in the box upon their return to his home. Her year out had come to an abrupt end. In 1983, Stan's encasement was relocated to a pit, freshly constructed by Mr. Hooker, under a shed. In better spirits, he released her to attend church services with his wife and work as a motel maid under an alias. When Mr. Hooker informed his wife that he intended to acquire new slaves and to add them to the pit alongside Stan, his wife visited their captive at her place of employment and revealed that the company was a concoction of her husband's. After an unfathomably horrifying 7 years, Stan was able to flee but phoned Mr. Hooker in tears, agreeing not to go to the police so as to give him an opportunity to reform. Some believe she may have been experiencing Stockholm Syndrome, in which a hostage experiences trust, loyalty, sympathy, affection, or in some cases, even sexual attraction toward a captor, possibly as a strategy for survival. That's what I was talking about, trauma bond, Stockholm Syndrome. Miss Hooker later turned in her husband. In light of her own maltreatment in exchange for testimony, she was not charged with any crime. She currently works under a new name as an advocate for victims of abuse. During Mr. Hooker's trial, he admitted to kidnapping Stan, who described to a stunned courtroom her 7-year ordeal of being repeatedly tortured and raped and confined for interminably long periods in a box that resembled a coffin. The judge, who described Mr. Hooker as the most dangerous psychopath he'd ever encountered and noted the cruelty and viciousness of his crimes, imposed a maximum sentence of 104 years in prison. At the end of the trial, Mr. Hooker remarked to his attorney, "I want you to thank the judge for me. I have a library, a gym, and the time to enjoy them. And it's better than living with those 2 women. Because there was no homicide in the case, capital punishment was not an option. However, one night be the opinion that Mr. Hooker's atrocities constituted a crime worse than murder in the first degree." So we're going to stop right there. Wow. Wowza. Rondi asked, she wanted to get pregnant. His wife wanted to get pregnant. So instead of inflicting the abuse of the slave to his wife, she found another person to replace her role, and she signed the sex contract or the slave contract. And then his wife got pregnant. They had a kid, and Stan took the place of his wife. This was intense, to say the least. Dr. BRUCATO, if you watch this book is amazing, but the psychiatric part, it's hard for me to follow or even understand. So hopefully, if you ever come up on panel, you can describe some of that stuff in clarity for the subs to understand as well. What do y'all think about this book so far? We're on chapter 22. Or chapter 10, category 22. It says, people talk sometimes of bestial cruelty, but others, that's a great injustice and an insult to the beast. A beast can never be so cruel as a man. So artistically cruel. The tiger only tears and gnaws. That's all he could do. He would never think of nailing people by the ears, even if he were able to do it. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov, 1879, translated by Constance Garnett in 1912. Okay, let me start this one. This one sounds pretty interesting. Y'all want me to keep going? Y'all want me to keep going? I can read a little more. I don't really have to go right now. I can read a little more. The reader is forewarned that this will not be an easy chapter to review. The individuals we will discuss herein will have been ranked at the extreme end of the gradations of evil scale, and the details of their crimes are the most likely to cause us to avert our eyes, cover our ears, hold our stomachs, and contemplate in blank bewilderment the existence of evil in its purest form. The serial rapist and murderer Tommy Lynn Sells, whose horrifying deeds we will presently explore, once remarked, "Take your worst nightmares and put my face to them." The people we will describe in the following vignettes might all lay claim to that blood-chilling, dubious distinction. Each one trapped, tortured, and dispatched unsuspecting men, women, and or children from this life with degrees of automation, detachment, and callousness we simply fail to comprehend in our fellow human beings. In all cases, the infliction of prolonged pain and suffering was the primary objective. For each, the sadism was interwoven with some perverse sexual motivation, which is usually, but not uniformly, the case for individuals designated to category 22 of the scale. Following their crimes, several of these Consummately, psychopathic killers use bodies, or parts of bodies, for a variety of unspeakable purposes, sometimes necrophilic, sometimes cannibalistic, and in some cases these were retained as trophies or mementos of the killer's happier times. Note that the 5 individuals we will discuss, all of whom were serial killers by any criteria, were selected for analysis because they were especially illustrative of the typical features and drives associated with this final category of the scale. There are numerous other psychopathic torture murders we are unable to cover due to space limitations. For those wishing to further study this extreme degree of evil, other highly instructive cases are those of Ian Brady, and Myra Hindley, the British couple who tortured and killed 5 young children, recording the screams of one victim for personal enjoyment. Dean Corll, who led a trio who abducted, severely sexually tortured, and killed at least 28 boys. And Charles Ng and Leonard Lake, who imprisoned women in a bunker, raping, torturing, and murdering them, often while taking home videos, sometimes killing the victims' husbands and young children. Ng and Lake had at least 11 victims, but as many as 25. I've heard of Charles Ng. Have y'all heard of Charles Ng? Yeah. Tommy Lynn Sells. In 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed for a single murder, that of 13-year-old Kayleen Katie Harris of San Antonio, Texas, on New Year's Eve in 1999. The girl's adopted father, Terry Harris, reportedly met Sells and his wife at their local church and began counseling them on their marriage in his own home, where Sells first encountered Katie. When her father was out of town one evening, Sells sneaked into the Harris home through a window where he found the girl sharing a bunk bed with a 10-year-old friend, Crystal Searles. He stripped and sexually assaulted his intended victim and then slashed both of the girls' throats with a butcher's blade so fiercely sharpened that it was whittled down to the width of a boning knife. After stabbing Katie 16 more times in a frenzy of sadism and sexual pleasure, he coolly gathered up items potentially marked with fingerprints and left the home. Searles, who miraculously survived the severing of her vocal cords, escaped to the home of a neighbor where she described Sells via handwritten messages. This resulted in the killer's arrest. Sells would later confess to the rapes and murders of approximately 70 men, women, and children across a wide swath of the United States between 1980 and 1999, although this number would never been confirmed. In light of his vagabond lifestyle, supported by train hopping, car theft, panhandling, stealing, working odd jobs, and occasionally selling property left behind by victims, he dubbed himself the Coast-to-Coast Killer. The transience and seething rage displayed by Sells dated to his earliest days. He and a twin sister, Tammy Jean, were born in Oakland, California in 1964 to Nina Sells, a single mother with 3 other children. Following a move to Missouri, both infants contracted spinal meningitis, which only Sells survived. He was therefore sent to live elsewhere in the state with an aunt, where he remained for 2.5 years before returning home. Throughout this period, he was often left to fend for himself, rarely attending school, and imbibing alcohol by the age of 7. Perhaps longing for a stable parental figure, he developed a friendship with a man from a nearby town, who showered him with attention and gifts and took him on frequent outings, only to eventually sexually assault him. By age 10, Sells had graduated to more frequent alcohol use and began smoking marijuana. 3 years later, when he climbed naked into his grandmother's bed, his mother barred him from their home and relocated the family to an undisclosed location. Days later, boiling with rage, he repeatedly pistol whipped a young woman. By age 14, he was drifting from town to town, stealing and working wherever possible, One day, reflecting on those formative years, he would call himself the little boy without a dream. Sells claimed to have committed his first murder the following year. Peering into the window of a home he was intending to burglarize, he supposedly spied a man molesting a young boy and found himself reminded of his own childhood sexual abuse. He fatally shot the perpetrator in a fit of intense rage. He would later describe this first homicide as producing a powerful euphoria, resulting in a lifelong passion for killing, which he compared to a heroin addiction. In a televised 2006 interview with Dr. Stone, Sells said of the shooting and his subsequent serial murders, "After I did it, it was like a rush, just like a shot of dope. The people don't matter. It's the crime. It's the sensation of the blood. The rush itself is the high." He later shot a man to death who caught him breaking into his home. Sells subsequently traveled to California, where he stabbed a male victim to death with an ice pick, became embroiled in gang activity, and repeatedly stabbed another man, just missing his spinal cord. In 1981, Sells attempted a reunion with his family in Arkansas, but he was once again evicted by his mother after he stripped and attempted to initiate sex with her during a shower. Perhaps this re-triggered copious anger toward those who had robbed him of his childhood. The mother he felt abandoned him, and the sham older friend who was, in fact, a pedophile. After seeking help in a mental health clinic where he stated, "I don't know who I am," Sells spiraled further into alcoholism and senseless violence, reportedly sexually assaulting a stranger for the first time. He claimed to have raped and murdered a woman in 1982, hurling her body into a flooded quarry in central Arkansas. He also shot a man to death. From this point onward, the killer's fury grew increasingly savage and more generalized, so that all humanity seemed fair game to him. For instance, several weeks after a woman innocently bumped into him on the street of a town through which he was passing, he repeatedly returned to the location to stalk her, followed her to her home, and brutally beat her to death with a baseball bat. Space issues prevent a full tally of the unfortunate victims he raped: stabbed, shot, bludgeoned, strangled, slashed, tortured, and occasionally mutilated between 1983 and his arrest in 1999. Punctuated only by several stints in jail for theft and drug and alcohol charges. However, it is of particular note that during this period, his depravity expanded to include the sexual assault and murder of children. He also developed a penchant for slaughtering people who were friends or relatives of one another, possibly psychologically rooted in envy of the stable homes and love these people seemed to share. He reportedly beat 2 young Missouri women and their 4-year-old children to death in separate instances in 1983 and 1985. It is unclear whether in his mind these mothers were representations of his own, who had rejected him from the only family he had ever known. In a controversial confession that is not universally accepted, Sells claimed that in 1987 he murdered an entire family, the Dardens. In one account, while hitchhiking through Illinois, he was picked up by Keith Darden and invited home for a hot meal. In another, he approached Darden when he noticed his trailer was for rent. The man was fatally shot, and his severed penis was placed inside his mouth. The killer then beat Darden's 3-year-old son to death with a bat and proceeded to attempt to rape his pregnant wife, Elaine, which induced labor. In a violent frenzy, the attacker used a bat to fatally bludgeon her and her newborn daughter, who was reportedly still connected by her umbilical cord, before inserting the weapon into the woman's vagina. Before leaving the Darden's home, the perpetrator reportedly positioned the bodies on a waterbed for reasons that are unknown, but may have held some personal psychological significance for him. If Sells did indeed commit this atrocity, it might have seen as representation of the pinnacle of his rage and resentment. The insertion of a bat into Miss Darden's vagina embellishes how inextricably his fury and his perverse sexual desires were intermingled in his mind. In an interview with serial killer profiler Stéphane Bourgoin, Sells claimed that his savage crime was prompted by a sexual past by Mr. Darden, stating, "I had to kill him, and because he decided to make a homosexual advance on me that cost him and his wife life." If this were true, his rage toward Darden may have reflected a merger in his psyche of a good Samaritan and a seemingly kind but actually depraved child molester from his youth. However, it was more likely a blatant fib to disavow personal responsibility. When asked why it was necessary to murder the children, Sells explained that he did not wish for them to grow up hearing about the loss of their parents, that he was preventing their future misery, having experienced parental abandonment himself. In another interview with Dr. Stone, the killer was asked why, if his objective for sometimes butchering children was to grant them mercy, he opted to do so in such cruel and painful ways. Sells was unable to provide an explanation. Asked further why he opted against using a firearm, he responded, "I don't like guns. They're dangerous." Wow. Wow. This is something. The callousness and fearless urge to kill without any shred of compassion exhibited by Sells were hallmarks of bona fide psychopathy, as with its complete inability to take responsibility for his actions. As noted, he sometimes attempted to justify his crimes with stories of personal victimization, such as child abuse, a man making sexual pass at him, or someone disrespecting him, which may or may not have been total fabrication. For example, he blamed a Kentucky community for his rape and strangulation of 13-year-old Haley McCone, reasoning that in failing to trim a patch of tall weeds alongside a public park, it provided him covering while he took the girl's life. Whatever casualties Sells may have attempted to portray, there can be no doubt that the chief motivation for his indiscriminate butchering of men, women, and children was to express intense, wide-reaching rage towards humanity and to punish other people, especially if they seem to be part of happy families or friendships or full of youth and promise, with the prolonged and intensely painful psychological and physical torment. Such sadistic behavior provided what he called a release of anger and seemed to have occasioned orgasmic sexual pleasure as well. I'm going to stop right there. Whoa. Melissa, did you really just type that? Chinese food is pretty good. I was going to have some chicken and rice earlier, but I decided against it. These cases are very extreme, and you know what's interesting is by reading this book and some of the most disturbing cases that I've presented lately, it seems to make a lot more sense. I don't know if it makes sense to you guys as far as what I'm reading, as far as the gradations of evil, but those cases that I've been portraying lately kind of echo with what I'm reading right now. It's severely disturbing to read rather than to see. But I'm at an hour and a half, so I think I'll let you guys go. And I'll probably be on tomorrow doing something different. I hope y'all have a good night. Thank you for being here. And Truth, if you're still listening, I will email you and we can discuss certain things, but I'm not going to argue with you or fight with you. If you happen to be in the chat, you're more than welcome to come back. I'll validate your thoughts, your commentary and things like that. Um, no hard feelings. With or without the wrench, you're still you. So, the rest of you, I hope y'all have a wonderful evening. Maestro, cue that music.